my father, my grandfather, my mother's father was a Chabadnik. His first cousin was Yechanan Gordon, who was the Rebbe's Gabbai, the Riyatza and the last Rebbe. And he used to take me to Farbrengen. As a matter of fact, I remember when I was 4 or 5, he took me once to a Farbrengen. He put me on his shoulders and told me, look down. I don't remember what I saw, but it was while the Riyatz was still living. So, L'chora I saw it. But the Rebbe himself I met on Kingston Avenue once, I have to tell you. If we're in Beit Chabad, I was once walking down Kingston Avenue towards Eastern Parkway, and he was coming up from Eastern Parkway, and we were right near Union Street, because I remember the exact time. And he looked at me with these piercing eyes that I will never forget in my life. I still remember the exact point that I was at when we crossed like that, and he had incredible, I mean, besides all of his other godless, but those eyes were, and then sometimes I would go to a Farbrengen and he would lift a l'chaim. Now there were hundreds and hundreds of Hasidim, but each time only one responded. Everybody knew when the Rebbe was looking at him. It was like,
no doubt.
Incredible. But I didn't become a Chabadnik, but I became a Tolna Chassid. So I am a Tolna Chassid. My Rebbe was Rabbi Yitzchak Twersky of Boston. He was the son-in-law of Rabbi Soloveitchik. He was the Tolna Rebbe, and he was also my professor at Harvard University. And I did my doctorate with him. And Kol Taroti Mimenu. I mean, I learned by the Rav also. I got smicha from the Rav, but my doctorate and my academic career is thanks to him. And he was an amazing, unbelievable person in his breadth of knowledge, Jewish particularly. He taught Jewish intellectual history, but he didn't start off as a Rebbe. I mean, his father was a Rebbe, and slowly he grew into it and took it on completely. And he was very makpid on all minhagim and all everything. Very loyal to his father-in-law. As a matter of fact, the Rav would daven in the Tolna Shtibel in Boston because it was after his wife passed away, and he was living with his daughter and son-in-law. And during the week, the Rav would come to daven in the Tolna Shtibel. So you have this unification.
What year did you get out?
I was in Boston. I got smicha in '69, and then I went to Boston to study with Professor Twersky, and I finished in '79, and then came right away on Aliyah. Didn't wait a minute.
Did you know Jake Rubenstein?
Sure. I knew Jake. Yeah, he was a student there. Yes. He was a fellow student.
My rabbi
in Providence.
He became my best friend.
Wow, I remember him very well. Sure, I remember Jake. And in Providence, actually, I was once, one Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I took over a shul, big, tremendous shul downtown. I gave the drasha, and I davened Shachris, and I read the Torah, and that's my Providence collection. So.
What you studied in the university?
I studied in the university Jewish intellectual history, medieval Jewish intellectual history. Professor Twersky's expertise was particularly the Rambam, and that's who we're going to talk about today. Particularly the Rambam. He wrote a major work on the Rambam's Mishneh Torah in English, but it was translated into Hebrew. It's in both languages. And then he dealt with the history of halacha and philosophy and Kabbalah during the time of the Rishonim. And recently I published a 760-page book, a collection of his articles, and wrote an introduction and described his methodology and described or tried to explain how does it come about that a Hasidic Rebbe who's a son-in-law of Rav Soloveitchik and a professor at Harvard becomes a harmonious personality. Zelo Pashut. But that's for a different lecture. But that's my that's my background. That's what I come with. I come with a background. Baruch Hashem, I learned with the Rav. I learned in the Kollel that was headed by Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. I did my doctorate with the other son-in-law, with Rav Twersky. So I bring a different perspectives on life and on Torah. So,
Did you know Professor Wolfson?
I met Professor Wolfson. Yes, I didn't know him well, but I met him. And I'll tell you briefly, then we'll start. I don't want to waste too much time. When I came to Harvard, he was already retired, but I made sure to read his book on Philo, 2 volumes. I don't know if I read the whole thing, but I read a good part of it. And it's an impressive work. It's an analysis of Philo's philosophy. According to him, the first Jewish philosopher, the first religious philosopher that ever lived was Philo. And he had a whole theory, which maybe I'll put it into what we're going to discuss today. And I saw him in the library. Harvard has the largest collection of Hebrew books in the world. They buy every Hebrew book printed any place in the world, even children's books. At one point I came back for a sabbatical and I had a son in the 2nd grade who grew up in Israel. And every week I would take out a pile of children's books because they were in Hebrew and they were in the Widener Library. Anyhow, I'm walking in Widener Library and I see Wolfson. I said, well, I have to think of something intelligent to ask him. Yeah. So I waited another week or 2 and I asked him my question. And I expected, after reading his book on Philo in a rich, elegant English, and he answered me in a heavy Litvish accent. He had been in America then by then already around 60 years, but he never lost his Slobodka accent. He took it with him to America, and he himself wasn't frum, but he considered himself an Orthodox Jew. In other words, the non-observant Orthodox. If you go to a shul, it's only to an Orthodox shul. He wouldn't consider anything else. And his Talmud Muvhak was Rabbi Yitzchak Twersky, the son of the Tolner Rebbe. And instead of writing, Wolfson dealt with general philosophy and Jewish philosophy and Arabic philosophy and Christian philosophy. And my teacher, Rabbi Twersky, said, that's very nice, but the essence of Judaism is halacha. And you have to, if you want to do a degree in Jewish studies, you have to know halacha, because it's halacha that's unified the Jewish people all through history. Right? People wrote about philosophy, people wrote about Kabbalah, all things, but what unified the people all through history was the study of the Talmud and the halacha. That way, a Jew from Bavel, from North Africa, from Spain, from France, from Provence, from Poland, from Russia, they all had something to talk about. Because they all learned halacha, they all learned Gemara. And many Jewish historians have simply ignored that fundamental point. Then let me give you an example. I'm sorry, I'm digressing, but there's a very famous book, The History of the Jews in Christian Spain, by Yitzchak Ber. Yitzchak Ber was one of the preeminent historians in the Jerusalem School of Historians back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and today it's considered as the authoritative history of the Jews in Christian Spain. He wrote it in German originally, then it came out in Hebrew, and then came out in English. And about 40 years after it was published, Professor Yisrael Tashma, who lived not far from here, an outstanding scholar of the history of halacha, decided to write a critique of Ber's book. And his major critique was the following. Ber dealt with the history of the Jews, he dealt with their cultural history, and he dealt with the disagreements about the study of philosophy and all kinds of things. He even wrote about the Ramban and the Rashba that were there, but he forgot that the Ramban's major work was his Chidushim on Shas. Ber didn't know that the Rashba's major contribution is his Chidushim on Shas. and that the Ritva has a multi-volume Chidushim on the Shas. He simply ignored completely these Gedolei Yisrael, whose major effort during their lifetime was to interpret the Gemara, didn't exist for him. And that's one of the things that Rabbi Twersky emphasized and re-emphasized and constantly re-emphasized was the centrality of halacha. That's true. There's philosophy, there's poetry, there's Musar, there's Drush, there's Parshanut HaMikra. That's all very important and very important. But none of it is important as halacha and its centrality. And so the student of Wolfson, the philosopher, he developed a program after Wolfson retired in which the centrality of the program was halacha. And we were all yeshiva bachrim sitting around the seminar table in Widener Library. As a matter of fact, when I went to Harvard, I applied also to Brandeis because Alexander Altman was there and I had done an MA in Jewish philosophy. And I was rejected from Brandeis. And I never knew why I was rejected from Brandeis and accepted at Harvard with a fellowship until 4 years ago. And the story is like this. I was sitting in the living room of a friend of mine, Menachem HaKohen, Menachem and Devorah Cohen, who lived not far from here. And she wrote an important history of a biography of Henrietta Zoll, which is worth reading, by the way. It came out in English now. It was printed in Hebrew and just came out in English. In any case, she had a guest at her house, Jonathan Sarna. Jonathan Sarna was the son of Nachum Sarna, who was head of Jewish studies at Brandeis. And I was telling him the story that I was accepted at Harvard and rejected at Brandeis. And he smiled, and he said, I know why. My father didn't want yeshiva bachurim in his graduate program. He was afraid it would create an imbalance of students who came through the universities with a limited knowledge of Yadus, and yeshiva boys who came with a wide knowledge. So he consistently avoided taking it. Rabbi Yitzchak Twersky was looking for yeshiva bachurim. That's what he wanted. That's what he wanted to be able to talk intelligently about the Rambam, about the Mishnah Torah, about the Perush HaMishnayos, about the whole wide, the width of Okay, now let's get down to work. The Rambam. I don't know how much you know about the Rambam, but there's no question that if you want to count Gedolei Yisrael, let's say from after the Gemara, we won't talk about Tanaim Amoraim. They're a story to themselves, and they have their own status. But from after the Chatimat Talmud, after the Sof Hora of Ravina Varavashi, I think I can safely say that there has never been a greater mind, a greater creativity in all areas of Yadus than the Rambam. When you talk about the history of halacha, you can divide the history of halacha into 3 periods. Before the Rambam, and after the Rambam. If you talk about the history of Jewish philosophy, you can talk about 3 periods. Before the Rambam, and after the Rambam. After the Rambam, nobody can ignore not the Mishnah Torah, not the Perush HaMishnayos, not the Mor Nevuchim, not whatever he's done. His impact is incredible. And in one of the articles in this book that I just published, Rabbi Twersky documented how Gedolei Yisrael described the Rambam throughout the generations. And one of the points of the article is that there is nobody in all the history of Jewish scholars that has received the kind of praise that the Rambam has received. And it's a big, big article in which he documents all through the generations, from the time of the passing of the during the lifetime of the Rambam, and afterwards until this very day. And then, of course, everybody has their own Rambam, because with such a giant, people like to take possession of the Rambam. Rabbi Twersky tried to present an objective view of him, and I'll get to that by himself. But I want to give a little bit of the background. First of all, the major works of the Rambam, and each one is a path-breaking work, is his Perush on the Mishnah, the Mishnah Torah, and the Moreh Nevuchim. There are other smaller works like his Igrot, like the Igeret Hashmad, and Igeret Teiman, and Igeret Chiyat HaMeitim, and his letter on astrology, and all of those, which are all very important. But we'll say a little bit about each of them, and incidentally, because of the centrality of halacha, well before that Rabbi Twersky had printed his book on the Rambam, he published a Maimonides Reader, a collection of the Rambam's works. And it was the first book about the Rambam which placed the Rambam's Mishnah Torah as the central element of his creativity, and then everything else connects with it. But who was it? Professor Zev Harvey from the Hebrew University wrote a review of this book and said that this now puts the Rambam in a proper perspective, that the central element of his creativity, the Rambam's creativity, is halacha, and we'll talk about it as the time goes through. Okay. A little bit of historical perspective. The Rambam was born in Cordoba in southern Spain in 1135. Spain at that time had emerged as one of the major centers of Jewish life in the world. And for that, we'll go back a few centuries very quickly and go through it. After the Chatimat HaTalmud, after the end of Rabbeinu Rav Ashi, and there's a short period of the Savoraim, but mainly the period of the Gaonim follows that. And that period of time, the center of all of Jewish life and scholarship was in Babylonia, was in Bavel. You had two major yeshivas, and they now, in Bavel, had the Mishnah, which is basically the first codification of Torah Shebaal Peh. Until Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Torah Shebaal Peh was only Torah Shebaal Peh. There are differences of opinion, incidentally, whether Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wrote the Mishnah or simply established the authority of the Mishnah, but it's remained Torah Shebaal Peh. And here you have a difference between the Ashkenazic and Sephardic traditions. In the Sephardic traditions, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wrote the Mishnah. In the Ashkenazic traditions, he compiled the Mishnah, but it remained Torah Shebaal Peh. And a couple of years ago, one of the important scholars in the Hebrew University wrote a major work showing that Torah Shebaal Peh remained Torah Shebaal Peh kipshuto, all during the period of the Amoraim, all during the period of the Savoraim, leading up until the earliest Gaonim. In other words, the Mishnah and the Gemara weren't written down in an official document until the beginning of the period of the Gaonim. And he shows it, he shows how this is true. He shows how you have many, many statements in the Gemara that talk about the Yegiya, the effort that you have to put into learning. And indeed, to remember all of that stuff, you have to put a lot of work in. We don't know what it is like to have an oral culture, but you know that in the Middle Ages, not only Jews had oral cultures, non-Jews had oral cultures, and they developed a methodology. There was one methodology, this is not Jewish, but it's useful, that in order to remember things, a person would build in his imagination a big building with 10 stories, and each story there are 10 rooms, and then he would put various types of information in each room, and therefore he'd be able, through his memory, to recover it. There were all kinds of methods for remembering. We don't need any methods now. We have our computers and we have our digital, and everything is recorded, and we don't have to remember anything, which is chabal, because I still remember things that I learned in my childhood, Be'al Peh, but not recently. No, I'm exaggerating, but still in all, the art of knowing things Be'al Peh, to a large degree, were lost. In any case, during the generations of the Gaonim, Jews were starting to move out into the Mediterranean area. What happened is that with the rise of Islam and a militant Islam, Islam captured the entire Middle East, they captured North Africa, and then they captured Spain, up until the Pyrenees. At the Pyrenees, the border of France, they were stopped, and that was it. But in any case, Muslim world was Spain, North Africa, and the Middle East. And that way, incidentally, Jews could travel easily through those areas because they were all ruled by Muslims. On the other hand, there were the Christian areas, Eretz Israel and Italy, which was a separate culture. The origin of the Jews in Italy basically were from Eretz Israel, and the origin of the Jews in Spain was from Bavel. So what happens is, in the later generations of the Gaonim, you have important settlements in North Africa. You have Rav Nissim Gaon and other well-known Gaonim in North Africa, and a development of Jewish culture in Spain, beginning with the end of the 10th century. Until the end of the 10th century, Europe is silent. We don't know what Jews are saying, what they're thinking, what they're learning, what they're writing, nothing. We have basically no evidence of, but there had to be a lot, because all of a sudden, the very end of the 10th century, Jewish creativity emerges from Spain. At the same time, in the school of Rabbeinu Gershon in Ashkenaz, Jews from Italy moved north because the rulers wanted the Jews to live among them because they were excellent traders. And they wanted good businessmen to come there, and they encouraged the Jews to come north. So you have these two centers that develop in Ashkenaz, and that carries over into France, of course, as well as in Spain. We'll focus right now on Spain because that's where the Rambam developed. Now, in the final generations, in the later, so you have the generations of the Gaonim up until the end of the 10th century. Now, what's happening there is that the Gaonim were basically controlling Jewish life all over, because there were no, there were no great Talmidei Chachamim until very close to that time, and if there were, they were all graduates of the yeshivas in Bavel. As a result, they took with them Talmud Didan. They took their own Talmud from Bavel. That, incidentally, is the reason that we learned the Talmud Bavli, not the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi, they didn't have any students, and the community had really shrunk, and the Talmud Yerushalmi was never really finished as a Talmud. The difference between the Yerushalmi and the Bavli went through an editorial process that made it easy to read, especially when the Saborayim brought in all the references to other sugyas that we would not even know how to find them, and they made it a literary work. So in any case, what you have is in the final 2 centuries in of the Gaonim in Bavel, you have a very interesting development. Not only are the Jews learning Gemara and Halacha, but you have personalities like Rav Sadia Gaon, who emerges as someone who looks around and sees that the Muslims have adopted for themselves a philosophic system. Now here's where we come back to Wolfson, that we mentioned before. Wolfson has a theory that the history of religious philosophy started with the Jews, but Philo wrote in Greek. Chazal didn't read Greek. Whatever Philo wrote was unknown to Chazal. They didn't know, they weren't able to read what Philo wrote, but what he did influence was the new Christianity that began developing at the end of the 1st and the 2nd centuries. And what Philo developed, the method that Philo developed, was as follows. He studied Greek philosophy. He knew Torah. And he said, it can't be that if philosophy is true and Torah is true, that there's a contradiction between them. Therefore, he developed a system which said either the philosophers misunderstood or did something wrong, or maybe I'm not understanding the Torah properly. And as a result, he used that methodology to resolve the seeming contradictions between the Torah and philosophy. The Christians liked that methodology because they were also confronted with a system in which they claimed had revelation from on high. They had a system, but it contradicted the philosophical principles. So the Christians adopted the Philonic method of resolving the religion with philosophy. And the church fathers of the 2nd and the 3rd centuries adopted that methodology, Augustine and other church fathers as well. Comes along Islam in the 7th century, and they began capturing all the areas, many of them ruled by Christians. And after they settle down and take over, they discover that the Christians have an interesting methodology of resolving the religion with philosophy. And they adopted it. And that was the Kalam philosophy of the Muslims. Then the Muslims find that there are Jews among them. And these Jews seem very naive because they seem to believe the literal meaning of many verses, and they try to argue with them. And along comes Rav Saadia Gaon and basically adopts the methodology of Islam, which was drawn from Christianity, which basically was drawn from the first philosopher, religious philosopher, who was a Jew, who was Philon. In other words, basically religious philosophy, which we have starting with Rav Saadia Gaon and continues on, was born with Philon. It went through a few Gilgulim, and it winded up back as part of our patrimony. So in any case, what happens in Babylonia in the 8th, 9th, and 10th century is a flourishing of culture, halacha and beyond, a philosophic culture. They develop poetry, they develop basically science and philosophy were one, but there were different aspects of it. And this culture is very quickly taken over by the Jews in Spain, because the Jews in Spain drew from the culture in Babel, in Babylonia, and beginning with the end of the 10th century, you have a flourishing of culture in Spain. Yes.
You said just now that they drew from the culture and halacha of Babylonia, but didn't they also, wasn't there also a constant emigration
There was,
from Babel into Spain?
yes,
through North
yes,
Africa and into
yes,
Spain?
yes, yes.
So it wasn't just knowledge.
Correct.
it was
As a matter of fact, there's a well-known story about the Arba Shvuyim, about the four captives, which is, we don't know whether it's historically correct, but it really tells the story of how Jews saw themselves replacing the Gaonim and taking over on their own. According to the story, there were 4 Rabbanim who were got on a ship for Hachnasat Kala. So people think Hachnasat Kala for somebody, girl who's getting married. But the Hachnasat Kala wasn't for a woman getting married. It was for the Yarchei Kala in Bavel. And they were basically raising money to support the yeshivas in Bavel. And that was a regular thing that the Jews all over the world, they supported the yeshivas, because the yeshivas provided Talmidei Chachamim, and they provided tshuvas to all of their halachic questions, and that's why they supported the yeshivas in Bavel. These 4 rabbis get on a ship, and they are hijacked, they're kidnapped, and they're taken aboard, and then they're sold to various communities in North Africa and in Spain. And the rabbi who was sold, quote, to the community in Spain was Moshe ben Chanoch, who came in very, very modestly, sat in the back of the Beis Medrash, and didn't say anything until somebody asked a very difficult kasha. And he raised his hand and he gave the teretz. They all looked at him. Wow, we want to hear some more. Anyhow, he became the Gadol Hador in Spain, and that's really the beginning of Talmudic study in Spain. You have similar stories in North Africa and in Italy, and basically it's a story of why the Gaonim, the yeshivas of the Gaonim declined, and these communities all over the world began to flourish. Now, it doesn't really matter whether it's historically true or not, but it's their own perception of now we are independent. Now we have our own Talmidei Chachamim, and they can paskin for us, and now we don't have to send money to Bavel anymore. And as a result, the yeshivas decline, and within 60 years or so, we have Rav Shira Gaon, Rav Hai Gaon. Rav Hai Gaon is considered the end of the Gaonim. It's not really quite the end, because the Gaonim continue, but they are no longer a major factor in Jewish life at the time. Yes?
What did Islam take from Christianity, because they consider it idol worship?
They took the method of resolving questions of the contradictions between knowledge that comes from revelation and knowledge that comes from rational philosophic insight. So it wasn't the content, it was basically the methodology of working it out. And then they applied their methodology to their own religion. But they didn't take the content of Christianity, they saw the model of the model which Philo began, Christianity adopted, went to Islam, and then the Jews adopted it. Again, the Jews didn't take the ideas of Islam, they took the methodology and then applied it to the Torah, to Yadus, to our own, and basically like returning it to the lost key to understanding it. So we have now in Spain a new situation. You have a flourishing culture of halacha and a whole line of Gdolei halacha. You have a flourishing line of philosophers. You have Shlomo ibn Gvirol, you have Yehuda Halevi, you have Avram ibn Dowd, and then you have the Kuzari, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and then the height of this philosophic school is the Rambam. This is basically a major shift in Jewish history. With this new center of Jewish learning, which was very varied and very rich and left a major impact upon our lives throughout the generation. Now, let's get back to the Rambam, who was our focus. The Rambam was born in Cordova in 1135. His father, Maimon, was a student of the Ri Migash. The Ri Migash was one of the outstanding Rishonim. As a matter of fact, the Rambam says about the Ri Migash. Some people thought that the Rambam was a Talmud of the Ri Migash, but the chronology doesn't work out. But he says something like Leiv Ha'ish Hazeh Madhim, or something like is unbelievable. The Rambam is saying about the Ri Migash, about how unbelievable a Talmud Chacham the Ri Migash was. And he saw himself, the Rambam saw himself as a Talmud Ne'eman of the Shoshelet HaKabbalah. And this is incidentally a very important notion all throughout Jewish history. The Rambam didn't see himself starting anything new. The Rambam saw himself as part of the Masorah. As a matter of fact, I've just edited a book of Shiurim that Rabbi Twersky gave in memory of the Rav after the Rav passed away. It's going to be published by Koren Magid. It should be out in another year. It's a group of shiurim, and we called the book Perpetuating the Masorah, because the major theme that Rabbi Twersky does there, this is not his academic book, this is his Torah Neto book, in which he emphasizes the importance of continuity of the Masorah. In other words, that we don't start from nothing. We don't start from Ephes. We work on a Masorah that started at Moshe Har Sinai and went through all the generations. And that's how the Rambam also started. He also, as a matter of fact, he even says in one place that on the Mishnah Torah that I've relied on the Rif. The Rif was one of the Gdolei HaRishonim. He said, and I hardly have differed from him except maybe in a couple of places. The Rambam himself was wrong, because he differed with him in more than a couple of places. But that doesn't matter. Basically, it's the sense of continuity of the Rambam that I am a Talmud of the Rif. I am following this Masorah. Now, I have these ideas and these interpretations, whatever, but it doesn't matter because the mindset is that we don't start from anew. We continue what the Rishonim and the Achronim and the Achronim and whatever, and we consider that, continue that Masorah. In any case, Yeah, okay, the Rambam. Now, three works of the Rambam. We won't have time to talk about at any length, of course. But the first of all, the Perush HaMishnah. The idea of writing a Perush to the Mishnah was almost, Rambam was almost the first. There was another Perush written to the Mishnah by Rabbi Natan Abba Yeshiva, but it never really spread, never had any impact. The Rambam saw the Mishnah as a work unto itself. In other words, not just part of the Gemara. No, we have the Mishnah in the Gemara, but today we have Mishnayos printed as a separate work. In the time of the Rambam, it didn't exist. There wasn't a separate book called the Mishnah. He basically invented that genre. He said that it's worthwhile studying the Mishnah in and of itself, and I am going to write a Perush on the Mishnah. So that is a major chiddush. And the Perush of the Mishnah, the Rambam, is a very, very important work to this day. In other words, it's a sefer that we still learn. We still understand the Mishnah through the Rambam's interpretation of it. And the reason that he wanted to do that is because Rambam has a system where he sees the Mishnah as the essence of all of Torah Shebaal Peh. In other words, if you want to know the Torah Shebaal Peh briefly, it's in the Mishnah. Once you know the Mishnah, you have all of the major themes of Torah Shebaal Peh, and that's what the Rambam did. He wrote a continuous Perush on the Mishnah, which emphasized that, which summarized the major sugyas. He didn't include the entire Gemara in his Perush, only those things that related to interpreting the Gemara itself. He finished that work at the age of 30. And the Rambam at that time was not in one place. I forgot to fill in on some of his biography. After he was born in 1135, but in 1148, Spain was invaded by the Almohads. They're like the Taliban today. And they gave Jews the alternative. Either you convert or we kill you. So the Mainon family succeeded in getting out of Spain on time. Many Jews did. As a matter of fact, it really was the destruction of the Jewish community in southern Spain, in Cordova and Granada, in those areas. And then many Jews went to northern Spain, other Jews went to North Africa, etc. They spread out. Rav Maimon and his family decided to go to North Africa, except that the result is that they went from the frying pan into the fire. So they had to get out of Morocco very quickly, and they came to Eretz Yisrael, and the Rambam has a very moving description of arriving in Eretz Yisrael, of coming to the Har HaBayit, of going to Hebron. Let me read a few sentences of it, because it's a very what you see there, by the way, I gave a shir on Shavuos night about the Rambam's attitude towards Eretz Yisrael. And many people think that the big heroes of Eretz Yisrael are Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Ramban and the Maharal, but the Rambam's attachment to Eretz Yisrael is incredible. We don't have time to talk about it, but let me just read the description of his arrival in Eretz Yisrael. Just a second. Where is it? I don't see it. It's someplace here. Just a second. Here it is. On Sunday evening, the 4th of Iyar, I went to see. They were in danger of drowning, etc. And he, okay. On Sunday evening, the 3rd of Sivan, I landed safely in Akko and thus escaped persecution. The persecution was in North Africa. The day on which we set foot in the land of Israel, I vowed to observe as a day of festivity and joy, accompanied by the distribution of gifts to the poor, right, matnos laniyim, as well as my offspring in all future generations. Tuesday, the 4th of Mar Cheshvan, listen to this. He came to Akko in Sivan. He didn't set out for Yerushalayim until Mar Cheshvan, because the Crusaders were ruling over Eretz Yisrael. And as he says, we arrived in Jerusalem from Akko after a dangerous journey. In other words, it's dangerous for Jews even to travel in Eretz Yisrael. I entered the site of the great and holy temple and prayed there on Thursday, the 6th of Mar Cheshvan. And then then 3 days later, he leaves Yerushalayim because of the danger, and he goes down to Hebron, and he also describes in very moving terms. In other words, the Rambam was a rationalist, but he had a heart. He really had a heart. He had a real dveikus with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and if we had time, I'd read you passages from the end of Minchas Tshuva and all over, which described the Rambam's passion and dveikus. You know, people say, oh, he's a rationalist. It's true, the Rambam was a rationalist, but he was a rationalist of the type that believed in everything of Yahadus so deeply and passionately that you can't say, oh, he was just a... It's like saying that the Rav was a brisker. Yeah, but it's true, he was a brisker. But if you read Kol Dodido Fake, if you read Milbikashta Misham, if you read Ish Emunah, you see the depths of the Rav's passion and dveikus. So sometimes people like to say, they're briskers, they're just rationalists, like the Rambam also. These people weren't just rationalists. There was a very deep emotional aspect to all of them. Okay, in any case, he leaves Eretz Yisrael, the Rambam, and settles in Egypt. That's the obvious reason is that he wasn't yet 30 years old. There was no possibility of living, of sustaining oneself in Eretz Yisrael. It was simply sakanas nefashos there. So he had to leave. He went down to Egypt, and that's where he lived his life. At first, he sat and learned, and his brother was a merchant, and he invested his money with his brother. He refused, the Rambam throughout his life, refused to receive a single penny for teaching Torah. Or for serving the congregation. The Rambam made a very, very strong case for it. Many Rishonim had to take exception of it because it's probably not possible to sustain rabbinic leadership without payment, but the Rambam was not willing to give up on that. And his brother traveled to India and drowned in the ship. His brother was a trader, and he was bringing spices from India, from wherever, and the Rambam lost his parnasa. He used his knowledge of science, particularly of medicine, and he became the doctor for the ruler of Egypt, and that's how he earned his money. And as a matter of fact, the Rambam tells a story. After the Rambam finished the Moreh Nevuchim, which he wrote in Arabic, Rav Shmuel ibn Tibon, who was living in southern France, translated it all into Hebrew. And he was corresponding with the Rambam at the time. Correspondence took a few months to go back and forth, but it worked. When Shmuel ibn Tibon finished, he wrote a letter to the Rambam and says, I want to come and sit with you because I have still a lot of questions. The Rambam says to him, fine, I'd be happy to meet with you, but the problem is like this. I get up early in the morning. I go down to serve the Sultan and all of his wives and his slaves and whatever, and I don't get back to my home till about 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock I eat the only meal that I eat in 24 hours, and then I treat the Jewish community until it's dark, until after it's dark, lying on my back flat, with no more strength left. That's what I do every day. On Shabbos, I daven with the community in the morning, and then in the afternoon I come back and I learn with them until nighttime, which means I will not have a single minute to give you if you come to see me. Now, you may ask, how could he have had the time to do all the other things? There's probably another reason why the Rambam didn't want to meet Shmuel ibn Tibon, we don't know, because that secret went to the grave with the Rambam. But the Rambam's description of his activities in his day is truly amazing. Okay, In any case, let's get back to his work. So we have the Perush HaMishnayos, which is groundbreaking, and the Perush HaMishnayos itself is, besides the Perush of each Mishnah, has 3 additional books included in the Perush HaMishnah. The Hakdama, the Rambam wrote a major introduction to the Perush HaMishnayos, which gives basically an overview of all of Torah Shebaal Peh and its workings, including the whole idea of the Doraisa and the Rabbanan, and deals with very important principles of Judaism in the introduction to the Mishnah. Then he has the introduction to Perek Chelek. The introduction to Perek Chelek is the last Perek in Sanhedrin. And the Mishnah in Sanhedrin starts like this: Kol Yisrael yesh lam chelek le'olam haba shenemar v'chulei v'chulei. And then continues, Ve'elu she'ein lahem chelek le'olam haba, hapikorsim v'mumarim v'hakofrim b'torah b'tchiyas hamesim, etc. So you have a Mishnah here with 2 major issues and 2 major problems. And the Rambam couldn't resist writing a long commentary on that one Mishnah, which is the introduction to Perek Chelek. It's a major work of Hashkafa, and it's a very important introduction. He deals with the concepts of what is Olam Haba. He deals with the whole issue of Agadata, and probably the most important contribution is when the Mishnah says, Ve'elu she'ein lahem chelek le'olam haba apikorsim. The Rambam said, well, we have to define. What is an apikoros? Because the Gemara doesn't define it. And the Rambam there details the Yud Gimel Ikarim, which is the first time in Jewish history that somebody put down a systematic list of the basic beliefs of Judaism. And that's a major work. There's a lot to be said on that, and that requires several shurim of themselves, of their own, whatever it might be. But that's the great importance of the Hakdama to Perek Chelek. And then he wrote another Hakdama. He wrote a Hakdama to his Perush on Pirkei Avos. And that Hakdama is called Shmona Prakim. The Shmona Prakim basically deals with the Rambam's ethical theory. And with a lot of other issues included there. And also 3 major works which are not, technically speaking, interpretations of any Mishnah, but basically broad, wide discussions of fundamental issues of Jewish thought. So you have, just in the Perush HaMishnah, a rich compilation of a Jewish thought. Then, after finishing his Perush HaMishnah, he decided to write the Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah is a major revolution in Jewish history. Never before and never afterwards has anybody written a Sefer Halacha L'Maisa on every single halacha in the Gemara. The Shulchan Aruch that we use, which is based upon the Torah, basically deals with mitzvos b'zman hazeh, but didn't bother with the binyan Beis Hamikdash, didn't bother with korbanos, didn't bother with Tuma and Tara. All of those things were not relevant after the Churban Habayis. The Rambam says, I can't cut that all out. This is part of Torah. And Divrei Torah aniyim b'makom echad, v'ashirim b'makom acher. And if I cut out part of Torah, then you'll miss the understanding of the parts that you're learning. And I have to have a comprehensive book that paskins halacha in every single halacha in the Gemara. Nobody's ever done it before, and nobody's done it afterwards. It didn't become, incidentally, the basis for our Shulchan Aruch. It's basically the Torah became, but that's because Jews need something tachlis. We need something, that I can't start looking up a book that has Hilchos Tuma and Tara because it's not relevant to me. So the more practical books became more popular than the Rambam. But the Rambam's Mishnah Torah became the yesod, the basis for all of halacha afterwards, for all the psikat halacha. As a matter of fact, the Mechaber in the Shulchan Aruch almost always uses the lashon of the Rambam when he paskins halacha, even when he disagrees, and he'll disagree with him, and he'll reverse the Rambam's psak, but he'll use the lashon of the Rambam. That was the tremendous accomplishment for Rambam. Yes. You wanted something? Okay. Yeah.
When did the outcry come, or the objections to this forum, and understanding when they heard this forum actually? What brought that?
Okay. I'll conclude with that because my time is coming to an end. But basically, what one of the major accomplishments of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah is that he included philosophy in the Mishnah Torah. In other words, if somebody wanted to know the Rambam's philosophical ideas, he didn't have to wait until he wrote the Moreh Nevuchim. One of the major points that Rabbi Twersky makes in his writings is that the Mishnah Torah itself, all through, not only in Sefer Hamada, but all through Mishnah Torah, you have the testimony to the Rambam's philosophical outlook. As a result, people saw, hold on, what is he mixing in here? Aristotle. What does he have to do? And maybe people who learn Aristotle become apikorsim. And there were people who were very afraid of philosophy. Now, the Rambam in his culture needed it because Jews of his culture were exposed to general philosophy, and he saw it of great importance to guide them and how to understand philosophy in the context of Yadus. But up in France, where the Balei Tosfos were, they didn't like that because we never heard of philosophy. We didn't deal with with Greek philosophy. So you, Rambam, are putting philosophy into the heads of these people. You may mislead them, and therefore they opposed it, and there were major battles against the Rambam. But that's a story in itself.
When was how much later was the Mishnah Torah, let's say, universally accepted, for lack of a better term?
Very quickly, because the one of the major conflicts around the Mishnah Torah was in 1240, 1232 to 1240. 1232, the Moreh Nevuchim was burnt in in Paris. And then the Christians said, well, as long as we burnt the Mishnah Torah, let's burn the Gemara as well. And in 1240, they burnt all the Gemaras that they can find in. When the Ramban, Rav Moshe ben Nachman, saw that, he said, we have to do something. So the Ramban wrote a very famous letter defending the Rambam. Now, the Ramban disagrees with the Rambam in many areas. You look at the Ramban al Torah, and in many, many things he disagrees and goes in different. But the Ramban realized the greatness of the Rambam, and you can't relate to the Rambam as somebody whose books that you can. So he wrote a major Igeret. It's in the Kitvei HaRamban, Terem Eshag Bani Aneh, in which he, despite his disagreements with the Rambam, wrote an amazing defense. That created the heroic picture of the Rambam, and from then on, he was defended. If people criticize philosophy, they criticize philosophy, but not the Rambam. Okay, Ad Kan.
Outstanding.